Okay, hello to everybody out there. Just give us a minute or two. We're just going to wait for everybody to log in and then we're going to start the program here. So go ahead and sit back for a minute and then we'll get started. Okay, for those of you that have joined us, just give us 1 minute. We're going to wait for everybody to log in and then we'll go ahead and get started. So just sit back.
Mhm.
Okay, thanks for everybody for coming in tonight. I'm Derek, one of the reference librarians. So once again, thanks for joining us. A couple quick little introductions, and then I'll introduce our speaker tonight, and we can get going. So we have a couple programs you may be interested in. On June 5th, which is a Wednesday, at 6:30 p.m., we have an in-person, the best-selling author Thriti Imungar is going to be talking about the Museum of Failures. Monday, June 10th at 6:30 p.m. Also in person, we have the horticulturist Martha McDowell, and she's going to be talking about gardening can be murder, how poisonous poppies, sinister shovels, and grib gardeners have inspired mystery writers. So again, that's in person. We also have another virtual program since we're talking about history today. So on Wednesday, June 19th at 6:30, we have a virtual program that is going to talk about Juneteenth, and it's going to be a live virtual tour. We're going to have a docent from Washington, D.C. that's going to walk around all the wonderful historic sites and having to do with African American history. So that's June 19th on Wednesday at 6:30. So if you're interested in any of these programs, you can go to hudsonlibrary.org and sign up. And a couple little small things before I introduce our speaker. We also are going to be selling copies of this book here, which our author is going to talk about, Left for Dead. So if you're curious about this book and want to learn more about it, there'll be a link there from the Learn It Out, which is our local bookseller. So you can go ahead and purchase it there. And by the way, we will have times for questions tonight. So there is going to be a Q&A thing at the bottom of your screen. So don't be too shy. Go ahead and ask some questions. Now, with us tonight, we have the best-selling author, Eric Jay Dolin, and he's going to be talking about his newest book, Left for Dead, Shipwreck, Treachery, and Survival at the End of the World. He's the author of 16 books, including Leviathan, The History of Whaling in America, which was chosen as one of the best nonfiction books of 2007 by the Los Angeles Times and the Boston Globe, and has also won the 2007 John Linman Award for U.S. Maritime History. His previous book, Rebels at Sea, Privateering in the American Revolution, was awarded the Française Tavern Museum Book Award and the Samuel Eliot Morrison Book Award as well for naval literature. A Furious Sky, the 500-year history of Americans' hurricanes, was selected for the Kirkus Prize, as well as chosen for one of the 50 notable books of nonfiction by the year by the Washington Post, and is one of the best science and technology books of 2020 by the Library Journal and Books List. He's a graduate of Brown, Yale, and MIT. And he lives in Marblehead, MA, and he's going to talk to us about his newest book. So I'll turn it over to the author.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I appreciate it. And thanks for those of you who showed up tonight. I'm talking to you from Marblehead, Massachusetts, quite a ways from Hudson, but one of these days I'll make it to Hudson. Left for Dead is the true story of a wild and fateful encounter between an American sealing vessel, a shipwrecked British brig, and a British warship that meet on the Falkland Islands during the War of 1812. The incident, if fraught with misunderstanding and mistrust, the incident left 3 British sailors and 2 Americans marooned on the Falklands for nearly 18 months. Oops, let's wait a second. It's a tale involving British and Americans meeting under the most stressful circumstances in times of war, kindness and compassion, drunkenness, the birth of a child, treachery, greed, lying, a hostile takeover, stellar leadership, ingenuity, severe privation, the great value of a good dog, perseverance, endurance, threats, bullying, banishment, a perilous 1,000-mile open ocean voyage in a 17.5-foot boat, an improbable rescue mission in a rickety ship, and legal battles over a dubious and disgraceful wartime prize. Now, the centerpiece of the book are the cold and extremely windy Falkland Islands, a sprawling archipelago of about 700 islands located about 300 miles from the east coast of South America and from the Strait of Magellan. If you mushed together all of the Falkland Islands into a single landmass, it would be roughly the size of Connecticut. The Falkland Islands have a stark beauty. The rugged landscape is undeniably spectacular. If you could see this picture up close, all the white stuff on the rocks is actually guano from black-eyed albatrosses, black-browed albatrosses. And the Falklands has the largest concentration of such birds in the world, about 700,000 pairs, and you'll see a picture of them later. This is settlement rookery in a storm, and I want to add that the Falklands is very cold and very windy. In the winter, the average temperature is about 36 degrees Fahrenheit, and in the summer, it's about 49 degrees Fahrenheit, and the average wind speed is 18 miles per hour. So that transforms a 36-degree temperature into about a 25 or 26-degree temperature. Here's another particularly stark image. This really captures for me the almost alien nature of the Falkland Islands. Now, the flora of the Falkland Islands, including sea cabbage and wild celery, is also very impressive, as is the fauna, such as this barn owl. Now, with regards to Left for Dead and the story I tell in the book, the most important animals on the Falkland Islands are the fur seals and the sea lions. Barnard, Charles Barnard, and his crew of 12 men, along with his trusty dog Scent, left New York Harbor and headed for the Falkland Islands on the 73-foot-long brig Nanina on April 12, 1812. They were hoping to strike it rich by gathering a hold full of seal skins, which could be sold in China for anywhere between 35 cents and $5 a piece. And to give you a sense of how large this industry was, in the late 1700s through the early 1800s, roughly 2.5 to 3 million seals were slaughtered throughout the Atlantic, Indian, and Pacific Oceans. So there were many dozens of ships, including quite a few American ones, that were engaged in the sealing trade. But it wasn't only seal skins that Barnard and his men were after. They also wanted to kill elephant seals and strip them of their blubber. They would pitch that blubber into iron trypots and melt it down to extract oil that was a very valuable luminant, second only to spermaceti oil, which could be gotten from the heads of sperm whales. Now, the Nina arrived on New Island on the western edge of the uninhabited Falklands on September 7th of 1812, and they moored in Hooker's Harbor. Now, Barnard took a great chance in leaving New York right on the eve of an embargo being placed by Congress and the president, a 90-day embargo that was basically to give ships that were at sea enough time to get back home to their home port before the war that everybody thought was inevitable broke out. But on January 3rd of 1813, after Barnard and his men had been in the Falklands for a few months, they discovered that the war they feared actually had occurred. And in the previous June, war had been declared. So America and Great Britain were at war. And the way that Barnard found out about this is that an American whaling ship, the Hope, arrived on the Falkland Islands and informed him of this change in circumstances. Now, the contract that Barnard had signed with the owners of the Nanina, John Murray and Son, required him to come back to an American port should he find out that war had broken out. But Barnard and his men decided that they didn't want to return to port right now and risk being captured by a British warship. Instead, they decided to stay in the Falklands for another year and continue sealing in the hope that the war would be over by the time they returned. But they couldn't stay at New Ireland because they knew that British whale ships during times of war were often armed and sent out as privateers to attack American merchant ships. And when they came to the Falklands, they often stopped at New Ireland. So Barnard and his men decided to relocate the Nanina about 40 miles away to Barnard's Harbor, which you can see at the lower right-hand corner of this image. This is part of the map that I had created for the book. Now, the men continued sealing, and they assumed that they were the only people on the islands. But in April, they discovered that they were not alone. Whoops. Months earlier, on December 4th, 1812, the 193-ton brig Isabella sailed from Port Jackson Harbor in the British penal colony of New South Wales, which is today part of Australia. And Port Jackson Harbor is what you know as Sydney Harbor today. The brig's destination was London via Cape Horn. In addition to a cargo of seal skins, whale oil, and mother of pearl shells, which would be used to make buttons, the Isabella had 54 people on board, including 34 passengers, 14 of whom were armed Royal Marines going home for some rest and relaxation, and another 10 passengers were pardoned convicts, or ones who had served their time in the penal colony in Australia, and 4 of those former convicts were female prostitutes. After nearly crashing into an island south of New Zealand and barely surviving a tempestuous sail around Cape Horn, on February 8th, the Isabella crashed onto a reef just off of Eagle Island, another part of the Falklands archipelago, and finally came to rest on a rock ledge not far from shore, a complete wreck. And if you read the book, you'll find out that the reason that they came to such grief had everything to do with the captain of the Isabella, George Hickton, who was an alcoholic. And at the time when he should have been on the main deck helping the ship sail these treacherous waters, he was down below in his cabin with one of the female prostitutes. Now, this map is the end map or end paper map that's in the book. And if you look on the upper left-hand corner, you can see New Ireland, and then in the middle is Barnard's Harbor. And then to the lower right-hand corner of the map, you see Eagle Island or Speedwell Island. That is where the Isabella wrecked. Miraculously, all on board made it safely to the beach. And in the ensuing days, they offloaded most of the cargo and created a makeshift settlement they dubbed Newtown Providence. Now, this anchor, it's hard to tell how big it is, but that shaft of the anchor from tip to tip, from top to bottom, is 12 feet long. And if both flukes of the anchor were in place, it would be 7 feet across. So this is a rather large anchor. And this picture, interestingly enough, was taken by Chris May. Chris and Lindsay May are both Falklanders who own Eagle Island, today Speedwell Island. They are the only 2 people that live on this island, along with 60,000 sheep that they own. A few weeks later, the survivors of the Isabella wreck sent 6 men off in the 17.5-foot longboat to get help. After a dramatic voyage of 1,200 miles, the men arrived in Buenos Aires. They met with the captain of the HMS Nereus, Peter Heywood, a survivor of the infamous mutiny on the Bounty. Now, Heywood was very sympathetic to the plight of the castaways, having had a lot of trouble at sea himself during the mutiny on the Bounty era. So he immediately sent the HMS Nancy, a British warship, captained by William Peter Duranda, to the Falklands to rescue the passengers of the Isabella. In the meantime, the situation back in the Falklands had taken a rather dramatic turn. In early April of 1813, Barnard and a few of his men had taken the Nanina's shallop, which is a small boat that was attached to the Nanina, and it was called the Young Nanina. They took it on a sealing voyage to Fox Bay on the eastern side of western Falkland Island. While there, Barnard saw smoke rising from Eagle Island, and he surmised that it must have come from some shipwrecked mariners. Upon investigating, they came upon Newtown, Providence, and the castaways from the Isabella. Despite the fact that America and Britain were at war, Barnard and the other Americans decided to do the humanitarian and noble thing, which was to offer to save the castaways and take them to South America, where they could gain passage to London. In exchange, Barnard required that the Americans be given all that remained on the Isabella and the Isabella's cargo, individual property excepted. Now, this was eminently fair, Charles argued, because by saving the castaways, the Americans were foregoing the rest of their sealing voyage, which thus far had been fairly profitable. So he felt that this was a fair exchange for cutting short their sealing efforts and saving the British. Now, the castaways greatly outnumbered the Americans, sealers, and could have easily overpowered them and taken the Nanina for their own. Nevertheless, all of the British, except for a few, enthusiastically agreed to the Americans' plan, even after Barnard told them that Britain and America were at war, which they didn't know. So this is the situation is that the Americans are going to save the British. They have no idea. Nobody has any idea. The British have no idea if their rescue mission that was sent to Buenos Aires had worked. So Barnard left some of his men behind on Eagle Island, and he took 22 of the British passengers and Marines back to where the Nanina was holed up, about 110 miles away. And the goal was to go get the Nanina ready to sail from the Falkland Islands. On May 3rd, 1813, the young Nanina was reunited with the Nanina, and Barnard and his men, along with the British, prepared to sail the Nanina back to Eagle Island to pick up the rest of the castaways. Now, at that very same moment, Commander Duranda and the Nancy reached Eagle Island. His arrival dramatically altered the Americans' and the Britons' plan. Duranda immediately tossed aside the agreement between the Americans and the castaways and declared the American ship a prize of war and said all the Americans would be made prisoners of war. Although some of the castaways felt that this was abominable behavior, given how well the Americans had treated them, none of the castaways stood up for the Americans. Instead, Duranda waited for the Nanina to arrive so he could claim it as a prize of war. But first came the shallop Young Nanina. It arrived at Eagle Island on May 16th and was promptly declared a prize, and the Americans on board were made prisoners. As the days turned into weeks and the Nanina failed to arrive, because Durand had been told that it was coming soon, but week after week, and the Nanina did not arrive, and there was a lot of bad weather. So Duranda feared that his prize had sunk and was never going to make it to Eagle Island. Well, the Nanina had not sunk, but something quite troubling had occurred. Atrocious weather and adverse winds kept the Nanina from heading to Eagle Island for weeks on end, and instead forced Barnard to pull the Nanina into New Island, anchoring in Coffin Harbor. On June 3rd, with the storm showing no signs of letting up, Barnard came to a decision. He thought it foolish to risk pressing on in such horrific weather. To that end, he recommended to Captain Robert Dury, shown here, the senior military officer on board in charge of the Royal Marines, that they move the Nanina to a more protected anchorage, strip its sails, and wait for better weather before proceeding to Eagle Island. Dury agreed that this was the most prudent course. When this plan was presented to all of the rest of the people on board, the British individuals, the majority gave their assent, and the Nanina was moved to Hooker's Harbor and moored close to shore. Just over a week later, when there was a brief break in the weather, Charles Barnard proposed using the boat on the Nina, which looked similar to this, to take a small party to neighboring Beaver Island to hunt hogs and replenish provisions, because everybody that was fixing up the Nina was fast running out of food. Just minutes after proposing the hunting trip, the British stormed forward on the Nina and demanded that the ship proceed immediately to Eagle Island. Barnard told them that time was not right. And he said as soon as he and the other men returned from the hunting expedition, they would leave. The British dropped their demand. Now, believing that things were under control, Barnard asked for volunteers to join his hunting party. One American and 3 British sailors stepped forward. On June 4th, they hopped into their boat, taking very little in the way of supplies, and headed for Beaver Island. On June 13th, the British renewed their demand that the Nanina set sail without delay, now that the fair weather had returned. Barnard's father, Valentine, vehemently protested such a move. And you have to read the book to understand why Barnard's father, Valentine, was on the ship. He was 63 years old and he had 2 hernias and he had multiple trusses sort of holding his body together. But anyway, he was horrified that they were going to leave before the hunting party returned. And he said, once they come back, we'll leave. Please relent in your demand. The British wouldn't have it, and they stood fast. Growing more alarmed, Valentine appealed to Captain Dury. And far from being sympathetic to the Americans' plight, Captain Dury sided with the other castaways, stating that he had no objection to the brig proceeding. Shocked by this answer, Valentine responded, "Your Marines are under your charge, and I demand of you assistance. And if you do not assist me, I conclude that you take charge and you shall be accountable for whatever happens." Unfortunately for Valentine and the missing men, Dury lacked a spine of steel. He ignored Valentine's plea. Over the continued objections of the Americans, the British Marines continued to get the Nina ready for sail. And on June 14th, they were ready to head out. One of the Americans knew that the British had no knowledge of the treacherous waters around the Falkland Islands, so he struck a deal. He agreed to take the helm and sail the Nanina to Eagle Island in exchange for one concession. He wanted the Nanina to stop at Beaver Island and pick up the hunting party. The British agreed to this humanitarian gesture, and off the Nanina sailed. But when the Nanina drew abreast of Beaver Island, the British reneged on their deal. The British refused to send the boat or even briefly come to anchor. Their only concession was to fire a few shots from a gun before sailing off. Valentine was apoplectic. He made it clear that to leave the crew on this island at the beginning of a dreadfully severe winter without food, raiment, or shelter was the equivalent of a death sentence. Unmoved, the British sailed off. When the Nanina arrived at Eagle Island, Duranda immediately declared it a prize, and all the Americans were made prisoners of war. The most plausible explanation for Duranda's decision to take the Nina and the young Nanina as prizes was that he was motivated purely by the glory of capturing a prize of war and collecting the profit that would ensue from the sale of the vessels and their cargo. In the coming weeks, the Americans begged Duranda to send out a search party to bring the hunting party back, but he refused. Finally, when he sent out a search party, it was only 3 men, and they only spent a day or two and went across Falkland Sound about 20 miles away instead of sailing all the way to Beaver Island, where they knew the hunting party had last been. On July 27th, exactly 170 days after the Isabella slammed ashore, and 44 days since the 5-man hunting party had been left on Beaver Island, the Nancy and the Nina left the Falkland Islands. The passengers and crew on the 2 vessels could only imagine what had happened to the hunting party, but what they imagined was almost certainly not as dramatic as what had actually occurred. The hunt on Beaver Island went very well, and soon the boat was full of dead hogs and geese. And on June 14th, they sailed back to New Ireland, fully expecting to see the Nanina waiting for them. But when they got there, the Nanina was gone. A frantic search at dawn turned up nothing. Refusing to believe that he and the other four men had been barbarously deserted, Barnard seized on one other alternative explanation. He argued that the Nanina must have gone back to Beaver Island, but went to the opposite side of the island from where the hunting party had been. So into the water the men went again with their boat. They sailed back to Beaver Island, and this time they entered the main harbor on the eastern side of the island. Upon entering the harbor, as Barnard later recalled, they experienced the almost insupportable anguish of neither finding the brig nor discovering any trace that she had been there. They had been cruelly abandoned at the beginning of a Falklands winter, with little to sustain them and absolutely no explanation of why they had been left in this horrific predicament. On June 15th, the men latched on to one final hope. The Nanina must have gone to Eagle Island. On such a slender reed, Charles and the others placed their faith. For more than a month, Barnard and the other men tried valiantly to sail back to Eagle Island, but their first attempt, they got hopelessly lost. Then they tried a second time, but this time they became so emaciated and weak that they had to turn back to Swan Island, which you can see next to Beaver Island here, where they established a rudimentary camp. After the Nancy and the Nina left Eagle Island, they split up. The Nancy headed to Buenos Aires, and then Duranda made his way to Rio de Janeiro, where he was reunited with the Nina. In Rio, Rear Admiral Sir Manly Dixon, I thought that was a great name for an admiral, Sir Manly Dixon, met with Duranda and the Americans and decided that a great injustice had occurred. Duranda, he argued, should never have claimed the Nanina as a prize, and the Americans shouldn't have been made prisoners of war. The Americans had acted nobly, agreeing to save the castaways, and he was greatly troubled by the way the Americans were treated and the disgraceful act of abandoning the hunting party. Dixon wanted to make a deal with Valentine, but after a lot of back and forth, they couldn't come to any agreement. And finally, Manly Dixon threw up his hands in despair and said, "That's it. I'm sending the Nanina back to London, where a court can determine who is her rightful owner." While Valentine was still negotiating with Dixon, some of the other Americans made their way back to the United States, and they had with them a lengthy protest that all the Americans had filled out while they were in Rio de Janeiro. As soon as they got back to the United States, that protest was published in newspapers throughout the land. And it was titled, the head of the protest was titled British Inhumanity. And there was a paragraph at the beginning of the protest that an editor in the Hudson Bee, a newspaper in New York, had written, and I am going to read that to you now. It says, "We request the attention of the reader to the following account of almost unparalleled ingratitude and treachery of the crew of a British ship to the crew of an American vessel, the latter having saved the lives of the former, whose vessel had been wrecked. And they, in return for this humane act, seized and made prize of the vessel and property of their preservers. Were it not that such a nation as Britain existed, this act of treachery might be correctly styled unparalleled. But British history is full of incidents of such black ingratitude. Such conduct, even in our enemy, cannot fail to call forth the indignant feelings of every American who has a drop of patriotic blood flowing in his veins." And keep in mind that protest was published while the war was still going on, so the Americans were still very upset with Great Britain. When the owners of the Nanina learned what had happened, there was little they could do. The war was raging. They couldn't send a rescue mission, nor could they go to London to plead their case. Now, they had no idea what happened to the hunting party. Had they known what had occurred, I think they would have been amazed and surprised. The men of the hunting party survived on their own from June 12th, 1813 through November 25th, 1814, a total of 534 days, most of the time living on New Island. They made clothes and shoes out of sealskins, subsisted mainly on a diet of hogs, geese, seals, native plants, potatoes, and albatross and penguin eggs. And they built a rudimentary hut out of sod, driftwood, sealskins, and the ribs of whales. This is an engraving that was in the 1829 book that Charles Barnard published about his experience. To cook and stay warm, they burned vines, driftwood, and the peat underlying the dense growths of tussock grass. You can see tussock grass right here. It actually can live to be 200 years old and grow to 9 foot high. And it's underlain by a very thick layer of peat, which burns almost as warm and hot, or as hot as coal. During this long period, they got into a few fights, had many adventures and misadventures, and faced much adversity. They went on numerous hunts, with Barnard's trusty dog Scent taking the lead. And that was especially important when they were hunting hogs, which are very fast and have two sets of very large tusks coming out of their mouth, which is just modified teeth. Scent was often injured in these fights. In fact, once he was gored in the groin, and another time he had one of his eyes poked out. Yet he continued to help the men hunt and was a loyal companion. At one point, the other men abandoned Barnard without telling him why. And they not only took Scent, his dog, but virtually everything else that he needed to survive. The deserters finally came back after 2 months. Barnard, a religious man, turned the other cheek and accepted them back into the fold, even though what they had done had been a dastardly turn of events. One of the men's most exciting and dangerous adventures was when they went sealing at the southwestern end of New Island, off these cliffs that were 200 feet high. They created this rope that you see here in the picture. And actually, the cliff was a little angled separately. They could use their feet. They weren't rappelling in free air. They were sort of rappelling down using their feet. But that rope was made from sea lion skins. They killed some very old and large sea lions and then cut off their skin in a thin spiral, sort of like cutting an orange in one peel. And then they would ravel together these skins, let them dry, and that made a very strong rope that they could use to get down to the bottom of the cliffs and then to haul up all of the seal skins that they were able to produce after slaughtering many seals. Now, the men's lonely and harsh existence on the Falkland Islands came to an end on November 25th, 1814, when the British whale ships Asp and Indispensable showed up. The two ships departed the Falklands with the survivors on November 29th, 1814. And in a very unusual coincidence, on that very day in London, the court decided the fate of the Nanina. The prize case appeared to be quite simple. Commander Duranda presented his side of the version of events, and nobody was there to dispute them. So the Prize Court of Appeals awarded the Nanina to Duranda and his men. But there was a year cooling off period, a year during which anybody could submit an appeal to the court's decision. After the Treaty of Ghent was signed on December 24th, 1814, ending the War of 1812, and the Senate ratified it a few months later, John Murray and Son, the owners of the Nanina, were free to travel to London to plead their case, and they arrived there in June. With the help of a local barrister, Murray launched a legal attack, and as a result, the Advocate General of the Civil Court urged Murray to appeal instantly the condemnation of the Nanina, stating that there is reason to think that the capture ought not to have been made. Appeal Murray did, his barrister submitting the paperwork on November 28, 1815, just a day before the one-year grace period would have run out. Finally, on February 5th, 1818, the Prize Appeal Court of the High Court of the Admiralty ruled in favor of the Murrays. They would be compensated for the cost of both the Nanina and its cargo. Justice was served, and Duranda was left with nothing. A situation left him complaining for the rest of his life. Barnard's journey back home was long and fascinating. It included stops in Lima, the Sandwich Islands or Hawaii, and in Canton, China. Finally, at the end of October 1816, years after he started his return journey, he had the unspeakable happiness of being back home in New York, where he reunited with his family and reported to the Nanina's owners, all of whom were thrilled and ecstatic to see him alive. And this image of South Street Seaport, I actually was there 4 days ago. I gave a talk at South Street Seaport on one of their ships. It doesn't quite look like this anymore. Instead of a bunch of ships and sailors, now you can spend $6 to get a latte. So it's sort of a high-priced little area. The rest of Barnard's life was not particularly noteworthy, and it included stints as the warden of the Port of New York and as commander of a lightship stationed off of Sandy Hook. And a lightship is just basically a lighthouse at sea. After encouragement from his friends, Barnard finally decided to write a book about his experience, which was published in 1829. Barnard died on November 13th, 1863, at the age of 83. Few newspapers covered his passing. One that did, the New York Herald, published an announcement that was a mere one sentence long. It said nothing at all about his ordeal on the Falklands so many years earlier. His life ended as it begun, in relative obscurity. This is the Captain Charles H. Barnard Museum on New Island. New Island is now a nature preserve. If you ever go to New Island as a tourist, you can take a tender or boat into the island. You can go to this museum and visit the 4 or 5 people who live on the island. Anyway, that's the end of my talk. I am happy to answer any questions you might have. Thanks for listening. I appreciate it.
Okay, great. So like we mentioned earlier, we're going to have time for some questions. So don't be shy. There's a little Q&A thing at the bottom of the screen. So our first question is, what inspired you to write this story? Did you find something in a book or a footnote that kind of sparked it?
Yes, and one of the most difficult things is trying to figure out what to write about, because you have to find something that interests you, that interests your literary agent, that interests the publisher, and that you think will interest readers. And it's a tall order to fill. So I'm always looking around for ideas. For this book, what happened is I was reading a compilation book that came out about 60 years ago, 50, 60 years ago. It was basically a list of shipwrecks and disasters from the 1500s to the 1800s. And for each one, it had a paragraph description. And I was reading through it and I said, oh, I know about that disaster. I know about that event. That's been written to death, blah, blah, blah. So I finally came to this paragraph that talked about Charles Barnard and 4 other men being intentionally marooned on the Falkland Islands for nearly 2 years. And that got my interest. And then beneath the paragraph, it said that he had written a book about his experience. So I got that book. I read it and I said, this is a really fascinating story. And fortunately for me, I didn't have to rely only on his account. There were logbooks, there was a court case, there were newspaper articles, there was the protest. There were a lot of other documents that I could draw upon to tell this story. So that's how I came upon the story and then ultimately told it.
Okay, so we have a question that's asking, you created one of the maps that was in the book. Is it
Yes.
basically you kind of looked at, I don't say Google Maps, but you looked at what the Falklands were and you kind of plotted out where all the adventure happened, and then you kind of submitted somebody to draw it? Is that kind of sort of the basis of that?
Yeah, I thank you for even thinking that I could draw that nicely, possibly. No, what happened is this is the third time I've worked with this artist. He's done maps for 2 of my other books, my pirate book and my fur trade book. So I have all these different accounts which talk about where people were at specific times. They mention the different islands, the different parts of the islands, the different parts of the Falklands. So there's a lot of information that I had that told me where the men went when they were trying to get back to Eagle Island, where the Nanina sailed, where the Nancy sailed. So I had that information, but it still was very difficult to figure out exactly, especially when the hunting party was trying to get back to Eagle Island, because I really had to. I bought these topographic maps of the Falkland Islands that were big, like 4 feet by 3 feet. I laid them down on the floor, and they came in different parts. So it wasn't just one map for the whole island. Each of those big maps only covered a little section. So I put them out, I put them on the floor, and I started drawing things. I said, okay, they said they were here on this day. They were here on this day. And once I had confidence that I knew where all the voyages had taken place, then I provided that information to David Kane, the artist in New York. He drew up rough maps using maps that were accessible to him, topographic maps, the same maps that I had. He sort of drew what the Falklands looked like, and then he started putting dashed lines. This is where these people went. This is where those people went. And then he'd send me rough cuts, and I'd say yes, no. You need to change this line, move it a little up. So we worked back and forth for a couple of weeks, and it finally got to the point where I felt we had captured accurately all the various voyages I wanted to depict. So it was a long process. It was also expensive. Cost me thousands of dollars to get that map made.
Mm.
And I have to
Yeah,
pay for it, not my publisher.
right. So early in your book, you talk about the American sailors that wanted to eventually sell the seal skins and the oil in China.
Right.
And later in the book, you did mention that some of the seal skins were starting to rot. So is that really
Yes.
feasible for somebody to take the skins and the oil to get it timely, or is it just however much stuff they have that's in good shape, that's what they have to sell?
No, okay. So two things. Once they treat the seal skins, basically they cut the skins off the seals. Then they cut as much of the flesh off the inner side of the pelt. Then they stake it out on the ground. They stretch it using pegs and rope. They let it dry. If it's sunny, it might only take a day or two. If it's a little cloudier, it takes longer. They let it dry, and basically those skins are like rigid cardboard or like salted codfish. They're very stiff, and they when they put them in the hold of the ship, they start to sweat a little bit, so they have to move them around. They clean them again. But if you go and create all these seal skins, and then a couple of months later you sail to China, they'll be in very good shape. You have to tend to them a little bit, air them out every once in a while. But if you've treated them properly, if you've skinned them properly and gotten rid of most of the flesh, then you'll basically have a hard as rock pelt at the other end, and then they can be treated. Then they soften them by using rocks and oil and other stuff. The reason they started rotting in England is because they had been in the hold for a long time. The sealers weren't taking good care of them, and they made it back to London where it was much warmer. So they were probably sweating a lot in the hold while they were trying to figure out what to do with the Nanina and its cargo. And that's why they finally decided they got permission from the court to take the skins off the boat and put them in a warehouse that had a more controlled climate so they didn't continue to rot. And if they did, they would lose the value of all those seal skins. But no, they had a lot of experienced sealers in preparing the skins and then getting them to China in good shape.
Okay, great. So you talk about this in the book, and you also did talk about it today about taking a ship prize. Can you kind of maybe expand upon that, like what that is? Is it a fast process? Who gets the money? How much money?
Yeah. Well, the short answer is I wrote a book, my last book called Rebels at Sea, Privateering During the American Revolution, talks all about the prize process. During war, ships that are given a letter of marque or British warships, for example, at war with the United States, and similar for the United States at war with Britain, you have permission to capture an enemy ship if you're a privateer or if you're a military vessel, like the USS Chesapeake or whatever. During the War of 1812, American warships, they captured British ships, and that would be a prize of war. They could bring them back, and it was a valid prize of war. Basically, the people on the ship get to split the value of the sale price of the vessel and the price of whatever cargo might have been on the ship. It's sort of creating an incentive system for people during times of war to put their lives on the line to capture enemy ships. So that's basically what the prize process was. It was more common, or what I talked about in my previous book, it was very common for privateers to do that because that was the whole purpose. They got a letter of marque, they could take enemy ships. If they were valid prizes, they would earn income from capturing those ships. It also happened with American military vessels, naval vessels, and British naval vessels, but not in the same numbers as it did with privateers.
Okay. We have a question about the writing process. How long did it take you to write that? And did you actually go to any of the sites mentioned in your book?
This one went fairly quickly because it was a very focused story. It probably took me out from beginning to end, research and everything, about 15 or 16 months. And I did not go to the Falkland Islands for a very practical reason. It's very expensive and time consuming to go to the Falkland Islands. And I didn't feel I needed to go there to use the Falklands as a character in the book, which they really are, because there's a lot written about the Falklands. I watched videos and I was proven correct because one of the people who blurbed the book grew up on the Falkland Islands, grew up on New Island. And after he read the manuscript, he wrote me an email in which he said, "You captured the Falkland Islands beautifully. However, I'd love to go to the Falkland Islands." And I told the people on the Falklands who helped me write this book by providing information and images that if the book sells well enough, my wife and I will go to the Falkland Islands. So it's going to be contingent on the book selling well enough so I earn some decent money. Which is always difficult when you're a writer.
So there's a lot of talk about sealskins in this book. What were they used for? Was this a European thing? Like in the 1700s, there was always beaver and beaver skins.
Right.
Was sealskin kind of the new thing, or was it just it was there for the taking?
Well, the Chinese were the biggest market, and they like sea otter for pelts above all. They were the most valuable, but they also like seal skins, and they would use them to make robes, boots, gloves, hats. So anything you might have used a sea otter pelt for, or not so much a beaver pelt, because beavers were mainly used to make hats, felt hats. But yeah, they were used in England. Even it wasn't just China. The lesser quality seal pelts were sent to America or to Europe, where they were used to make sort of outer garments, coats, rough coats and boots. But in China, you get a little bit more money, especially for fur seals, which were very plush and soft, and they would be used for robes or other types of finery.
So this is an interesting question somebody asked, but what's the best food to keep on a ship during this time? Because there's no refrigerator, there's obviously no
Yeah.
microwave. You're kind of stuck with what you have. What on earth do you even put on a ship that'll last that long?
Well, one of the things they used extensively was called hardtack, which is basically biscuits that have been dried to the consistency of a brick, and you can chew on them and soften them up by putting them in water. But relatively nutritious, a lot of made out of wheat and flour, and but hard as a brick. And they though can rot. Weevils can get in and maggots and can cause problems even with hardtack. They used to have meat on board. They'd have it in barrels. That would tend to go bad, but the men would often still eat it. While they were on the ship, they would fish. And actually, the Nina, on the way down to the Falklands, caught quite a few fish, dolphin fish and cowfish, and they actually caught a porpoise once. So they would catch fish to supplement their fare. You also could have on board dried fish like codfish, which was very, very salted cod, was really hard and very resistant to rotting and being attacked by maggots because it had such a high salt content. But they would soak that to soften it up a bit and get rid of some of the salt content, and they would eat that. They would also get fruit and vegetables wherever they could stop. On the way down, the men on the Nina stopped at the Cape Verde Islands, where they got fresh water. They got pumpkins, squash, other potatoes, other kinds of vegetables that did last for a while. And they also tried to stock up on meat. But in general, the fare on any ship during the Great Age of Sail that stayed at sea for any amount of time was pretty miserable.
So we have a question here about prisoners of war. So if you were taken, by prisoner and you're an American sailor, what
Yep,
happened after that? Ships didn't have a lot of, well, space. They didn't really have too much room for really much anything, much less people. What would happen?
right. Well, if they decided to take them back, to a prison, they would have to be put in the lower deck and usually shackled or watched by somebody, an armed guard. And many of them were taken back to England, where there were prisons where they could be placed. Sometimes, if they decided that it wasn't worth the hassle of bringing the prisoners back, they would just let them go. Uh, Maybe a nearby piece, the nearest piece of land, they would, you know, let them get off. Or if they had another ship, they might let them take off on that ship. But a lot of these ships did have enough room for prisoners, especially if it was a merchant ship that was captured and there were only 10 or 12 people on board. And they would take them back to a prison. And there were rules of war. You weren't supposed to treat your prisoners poorly, but sometimes they weren't treated in the best of conditions. So it really depended on the circumstance. If there were just too many prisoners and you couldn't possibly take them, then they'd have to come up with some other solution.
Okay.
They wouldn't kill them outright. At least I'm not aware of any instances in which they just killed prisoners. But
Yeah. So we have time for a few more questions. So somebody asks, were there any stories that you found in your research that didn't fit into the book? In other words, is there something that you're filing away for later?
oh no, not for later for a book. There were certain things that, and I can't remember off the top of my head, things that were cut in the editing process that were about this story. But no, there's not a single thing I found while researching this book that sparked an idea for another book. I'm working on another book now about another shipwreck in the Pacific Ocean. Totally different circumstances. More people die, or people die, and it's sort of an East versus West kind of story and involves a whale ship. But no, this book is not going to spawn another book about the Falklands or something else. Whereas some of my earlier books, there was something I found in that book that got me interested in writing my next book, but not with this book.
We have a comment about your the cover of the book that you have up there. They said it's wonderful. Did you design it, or did the publisher or an artist? How did that sort of come about?
I'm very involved. I'm not a good artist, but I'm very involved in the covers, all the covers. I come up with the titles for all the books. My publisher involves me. I recommend images for the cover. I recommend a feel for the cover. For this book, there were no good pieces of art relating to the event that I was writing about. So the design people found this image, and I said, "Yeah, that's a great image." And so we took that image and we had a back and forth, different designs. There were other images they recommended, and I was given 3 or 4 to pick from, and I picked this one.
Okay. Well, that about wraps things up. So thank you so much for talking, Mr. Dolan, tonight about your latest book, Left for Dead. We all enjoyed it. It was very good.
Thank you very much for having me, and
Yeah,
maybe someday I will come to Hudson,
we'd love that. Yeah, absolutely.
Ohio.
So
Okay.
one thing I'll mention before we sign off tonight is some of you have logged in kind of late. No problem. It has being recorded, so it'll be on our Hudson Library and Historical Society YouTube channel. So just search for that, and our video will be uploaded there probably in a couple days. So once again, thank you, and we'll see you again. Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.
Night out.